Thank you. I snapped at your comment about shifting away from the one-on-one mentorship model when I'm in the sociology department, so I'll out myself not as a historian, but as it was by training, but historians since I was 5 telling stories and really caring about shifts from the past to the present into the future. And so when I think about particularly how institutions are thinking mentorship can handle institutional inequality, can close achievement gaps, as it were, particularly in higher education, I think that the burden of the model of a one-to-one is anachronistic at this point, and I think it is important, and I really appreciated that you brought that up as a point here, particularly in conferences, because I think institutions think it's sexy to like envision mentorship as handling the distribution of power and disadvantage, but not if you stick with a one-to-one model, especially considering identity formation at this sort of moment. So I wanted to say thank you. It isn't a question at all, but being a first-gen student, being someone who applied to undergrad as well as graduate school as a homeless, highly mobile, displaced student, there was no idea of a one-to-one in my department who could understand what it meant to learn by being displaced, right? They had zero concept of what that is like. And so a lot of examples in classrooms being about your bedroom, your home, the backyard, a lot of the classist sort of understandings of how education happens, how learning happens, and the assumption of stability, a lot that happens in higher ed. So I wanted to really thank you for that, because a community model of mentoring can be possible, it can be envisioned, it really takes commitment of faculty to committing openly and saying that as one individual they cannot in any way do what mentorship requires of a relationship. So I really wanted to just say thank you for that, and it was refreshing to be here in this warm room and to hear a breath of fresh air. Like, thank you that someone is thinking about mentorship and envisioning it in a future way that includes more bodies, more knowledge, more spatial sort of reasoning, and a less stable, as it were, bond between the graduate student and one faculty mentor.
Well, thank you so much for your comment. And yeah, I think I was really lucky in the way that I, coming into this program, and I'm not sure if it was because I was an older student and my sort of, committee sort of thought that I, could navigate, that I could navigate and didn't need like a one-on-one relationship, because I was really free among, my advisors to form this sort of community idea of advisors, and I really feel like I had that. But I also noticed that some other folks did not have that, and I also, in conversations with them, felt like it was a disadvantage, right, compared to the experiences that I had with a lot of faculty members sort of helping me in different ways, right? Yeah.
This is a question for both of you. Thank you for both of your talks. It was very moving. Related to the question of moving beyond just a single authorship dissertation, I think to me that sounds really far away in the future. But getting to that point, how do you get over the fear of sharing your ideas? This is serious, how do you get over the fear of just, you're doing your research and there's a sense of like, I don't want to give my ideas away. But is that fear unfounded? Is that fear not productive towards getting to a more collaborative dissertation writing process? And how do you think through that problem of your ideas?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. I mean, someone who has co-authored 9, 8, 7, I don't know how many books and articles and a variety of other things. I mean, part of it is actually figuring out your own ego, right? I mean, and so how do you actually deal with your own ego? So Jay mentioned the book I wrote with Heidi, Artisan. Heidi was a graduate student, was one of my doctoral students in American culture. And she was writing a dissertation on interracialness in the first half of the 20th century. And I said to her one day, I said, yeah, there's this case that I came across 15 years ago in researching, but I don't remember the name or anything. So she actually went and did the lab work and found it, came back and said, I don't think I want to do work spend my dissertation on this. I said, okay, fine. I said, I think there's enough that we should look at it. So we did, and we decided we'll write an article. And then the article became a book. And so it became her first book before she finished her dissertation. And in fact, her dissertation is now her third book. It's because she wrote another book, a biography in between, that Norton also published. But I remember sitting in the basement arguing over an interpretation. We were looking at these documents, and we didn't see the documents in the same way. And at that moment, I had to realize I was no longer her dissertation advisor. I was her colleague, and we were trying to figure out how to write a book together. And we couldn't reconcile. We actually had different interpretations. So we actually offered both as a way of actually looking at a particular moment, historical moment. We say, well, you know, think in the 70s, how many historians wrote on slavery? Many of them all in the Rochester department. At the same time, they came to hate one another after a while, but at least for a while, they were in conversation with one another. And it's that piece of trying to figure out how you actually become comfortable enough in yourself. That, and particularly if you are senior like I was, and you recognize the hierarchy, that in some ways you have to actually, Jack's point, so level out the hierarchy in such a way that it makes it possible. And it's not true, not everyone can do that. And not everyone you want as your collaborator. Point be told. I was very selective about who I collaborated with over the years. There were some people I knew, and there was no way. We're going to drive each other crazy. And so that piece at least was my experience in working through some bits of trying to settle on. And the idea, I mean, this is one, so just a little factoid, because I had to go through the University of Michigan accreditation process for becoming a PI on grants. And there's one of these modules, I don't know if anybody else has taken it recently, it says that, there's a module which says no one owns an idea. There's a statement in this sentence that reminds you that you may have a site, but you don't own an idea. You can own certain things, but ideas actually can float out there in the universe. And so if you get hung up on the idea, it's one thing. If you get hung up on the interpretation and the ways of looking, then that's what you can negotiate and work with.
And if I also can add to that, I mean, my personal opinion would be if co-authoring a dissertation is the first time you're doing collaborative writing, you might want to rethink that, right? That there's all of these opportunities before that to sort of practice the idea of collaborative writing. And one of the more successful and first experiences I ever had doing collaborative writing was with when we were sitting down to write our nomination for the National Historic Landmarks. We were sitting down to write a letter of intent. Was that what it was, Joe? Mm-hmm. Right? And Professor McClellan basically put us all in the room. This is when we were writing our National Historic Landmark. And she said, okay, we need to write this letter of intent collaboratively, and we're not leaving this room until we do. Right? And of course, you know, it didn't take that long, but we did it. And it was that experience of learning how to step forward and how to step back, you know, when doing that collaborative writing process, and then practicing it over and over and over again, and getting, like you said, comfortable, you know, with that collaboration. Then from there, sort of moving on to bigger projects.
Hi, I really loved both of these talks. I guess my question is about mentoring again, and it's a thing that I'm thinking about is the idea of community or village mentoring, and this is kind of related to the idea of individual authorship as well, but it's the idea of when you have one person who you know is supposed to be your advisor, your instructor, you feel that there is a commitment being made to you, some kind of like an attachment of energy and of effort. And I'm kind of curious about how you keep that same kind of like responsibility or the same kind of accountability, maybe that's the word, accountability when you are sharing the burden across many different people. And the thing that I'm kind of thinking here is like, how do you prevent, or not prevent, but what do you do with the wayward students, right, who are in neglectful relationships with their mentors, and no one is intentionally charged with, being their person. I'm kind of curious about, like, how do we basically right now we have individual responsibility. That's like the moral system we got. Okay, how do we broaden that out and have it work with what you're proposing here with community mentoring? Because I want to know.
I'm thinking this is a really great question that I probably don't have a great answer to, right? And I know that in my own graduate career, there came a moment about halfway through that there were some things that happened with my advisor, and then I had to switch advisors, and it was a moment where I felt sort of lost at sea, right? And had to take a moment to regather the resources and figure out who was going to sort of steer the ship again. And I remember feeling that was an incredibly lonely moment, and it was a moment that I feel like could have gone disastrously, right? And so, I feel like in that moment, it's sort of like, well, the larger institution, the larger department to keep track of students and make sure that they're not, being lost through the cracks. And how that would look in reality, I have no idea. Yeah.
Part of this goes to both faculty and students. It had to be in this conversation together. And so I made reference, I played the role of historian by going back to 1996, 1997, and a series of efforts at the national level to reform doctoral education in the United States. But if you go back and read actually the pamphlet that we put together on mentoring for graduate students at the University of Michigan circa 1999, 2000, it says three things, it says more than three things, but three things I think pertinent here. One is that students should actually have more than one mentor. They should actually systematically seek them out, and they should seek them out among faculty, staff, and other students. Meaning, so it's not just that somehow that mentoring should come just from the faculty, but the staff in almost every department actually, they know how the department runs sometimes better than most faculty, and are people to know. And then students, because as you're building at different stages of your career, you want to need to lean on your peers in one way or another, be they the misfit historians who gather, or some other group of historians or colleagues somewhere else. And that part of trying to figure out mentoring, trying to figure out as part of mentoring, are there mechanisms that allow you to do it? I'm looking at Adrian. So back in the late 90s, when Adrian was here, I had a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation on African Americans in the industrial age. I got to the point where I could no longer oversee the seminars that we created. I handed it over to Adrian and a group of cohort of graduate students. Okay, for the next 3 years, you run it. This is yours to actually get that experience of running it. They created a team, brought in speakers, continued just moving ahead in a way that allowed them to actually gain a set of experiences as well, but also create a network. And I think part of it is, yes, every department needs to know where the students are, and there must be some kind of way of checking in. The graduate school used to have some systematic mechanisms for doing that, but the students and faculty need to understand that mentoring always has been a shared, in my view, in the best models, always has been a shared responsibility. And I used to always say to my students, I said, I don't intend to die, but if I die tomorrow, I need to make sure that there's somebody around and that actually is going to be there to step in. And it's almost that model. I mean, because dying can be in a literal figurative sense. You can disappear to take on a whole new set of responsibilities. And when I became graduate dean, that was true in a certain kind of way. And so then there had to be others there to play a role. And I think for us, it's a fascinating thing about higher education. We produce a lot of material in any given year, and we study a lot of things. we don't always keep tabs of the things we've generated ourselves that sort of have a life cycle of 5 years and then they get shelved somewhere. And so it may be a time to go back and look at a couple of the treatises that we actually produced in the past that can be useful because they involve talking to a lot of people. And so that would be another place to look to continue this conversation, both with your advisors, your peers, and others that you may want to talk to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the University of Michigan, as I recall my graduate student experience, is such that students have the capacity, some capacity to assemble a kind of committee, if you think of mentorship that way, kind of committee that enables them to cash in on a variety of skills from many different departments across campus. The second thing is, I was privileged to open on any door in the department and in CAS, then CAS. And the faculty were always willing to chip in. People would mistake some faculty members for being my advisor or my committee. It turned out they were not even on my committee at all. So there is that leeway. And then I was also privileged to have graduate students who were senior to me, who really anchored me and made me feel I'm not a phony. I was coming from Zimbabwe, from South Africa at that time, and I knew nothing even about snow. And I remember David William Cohen saying, just get a coat. So there are elements that I see here that could make for, I think, very good ingredients there for what we used to call you Dean Earl, or what Dean Earl is saying. There are elements there that you can really begin to build on. I must say I haven't seen too many graduate programs. We may be talking about history here, but I haven't seen any graduate program, to my knowledge, that allows a graduate student to make their degree as interdisciplinary as they possibly can, and to bring around them an intellectual community that speaks to those interests. So I think that what you're saying is not too far-fetched. I think if there is a place it should start, that kind of experiment, it's here. And I don't think it will come simply from statute books within the university or faculty per se or LSA. But I think students could be part of making that happen. They are co-builders in this program.
Yeah. Totally agree.
I don't know if the microphone's working. I can talk loud. Is it working?
Hello. All right, I wanted to ask or Jackie, you brought up the point about tenure, and I know also you've probably been very involved over the years in many different ways thinking about that. And I think that question about public history and tenure, as well as co-authoring, not only at the dissertation level, but also when one goes up, especially since external reviewers are often external to one's institution and going by guidelines at theirs. How do we shift that more broadly, not just at our institution, which hopefully we can, but also, and also thinking about the HA because I think part of the problem is, while there's a shifting discourse about the value of that, when you are being judged and the decisions being made whether you get to preserve your job or lose it, right, it's often hanging on the balance of other things that are not publicly facing history.
You go first.
Okay. So about a decade ago, Imagine in America, which is this project that had its origins here on this campus, actually spent probably 3 years coming up with a set of guidelines on public history and public scholarship and how to value public scholarship and promulgate that across the country. I don't know how many here have actually ever seen this document. And it was with the hope and that indeed it will begin to actually set at least a framework when we're talking about public scholarship, how it should be thought of. How do you actually ask then external reviewers to ask questions? What gets counted? And you know, and it reminds me, and yeah. So there's a point in my life where I've read more tenure and promotion files than the number in the hundreds, and so especially when I was a provost at Emory. And you realize the challenge that we face, however, is that there are, I don't know, more than a dozen microcultures that actually are working with. I mean, look at Nathan, in a place like Hopkins, what the medical school will count may not be what Krieger and arts and sciences would recognize. I mean, I'll give an example here. Some years ago, some of you know Jonathan Metzl, who psychiatrist and American cultures. And I remember talking to the people in the medical school because they didn't know what to do with a book. And they literally didn't know what to do with a book. And it's like, how did we count it? Is it 8 articles or did we count it? And so there's all this translation work, just period, inside the academy. And so the public scholarship piece to me is just a continuation of that translation work inside of the academy and how we go about it. There are, but Imagine America actually, after almost 3 years of talking all over the place, came up with, at least with a framework for saying, here's what the majority of institutions are saying that they actually can understand and would tolerate. And if you haven't seen it, there may be a useful place to start, because then you don't have to start the conversation from the beginning again. You can say, this is a conversation that's a mature conversation. I mean, it actually has involved scores of scholars in many different locations talking about this in this way. But remembering, going back, that no matter what, each campus, though, there's something about these microcultures. And that always requires a series of someone there being able to say, okay, so you mean a Nature article with 8 or 9 or 10 authors is more important than a single author book from Oxford? No. Or, you know, these are different ways of being able to, going back to the question, what then is the advancement of knowledge in whatever way that we're doing it? And this is a contribution to advancing, and that remains our challenge inside, at least most of the places I've spent time or been involved with. Jim's trying to jump in.
Yeah, there is the AHA does have a document. It's a little old on evaluating public history, and it's actually used by a lot of departments. It tends to be more effective with the upper administration than with one's own colleagues, actually, believe it or not. That when one waves it in front of a dean who's a chemist and says, the AHA says this counts, that actually is effective. It's very ineffective to wave it in front of the rest of the history department. So we do have that. The Council of Graduate Schools has recently gotten a grant from the National Science Foundation to embark upon broadening the definition of science. They're trying to find somebody to fund the humanities piece of that, and we're working with them. And then also we are actually now at the beginning of a process of trying to broaden the definition of scholarship, because there's a difference between public history and public scholarship. That's the problem. The document that we have is about public history. That doesn't include blogs, doesn't include op-eds. That's not something people consider to be public history. And the question becomes, how do you evaluate that? There are scholarly op-eds, and there are punditry op-eds. How can a historian say, this is a scholarly op-ed and I want this included? We're going to try to come up with basically a process for post hoc peer review. The notion that that doesn't count because it's not peer reviewed is silly, because it can be peer reviewed. So hopefully we'll have that in about a year. But it is something that we are.
Okay, thank you. So thank you both for your talks, and this is on. Thank you, Jacqueline, especially for your video. I have graduate students who published on your site and multiple pieces in some cases, so it ends up being their first foray into seeing themselves as a scholar. So it's an extraordinary resource in that sense. I actually have a question about maintenance. In my various kind of forays into doing different kinds of digital work, whether it's mapping projects or thinking about podcasting or even oral history projects, one of the things that invariably becomes a challenge is maintaining this digital faith, server space, holding people accountable for basic upkeep, bugs, customer service, right, whatever you, and that ends up being oftentimes an extraordinary expense of time and attention that, apart from just the line on a CV, doesn't have any way at all of showing up in the currency of these institutions. I actually remember in considering being promoted from associate to full, to echo Jim's point, the only way to understand any of this stuff is with paper. So the idea was to just print out everything I'd ever done and put it in a dossier, and that's the way you're going to understand it, because that's durable and you can hold on to that. So as part of what we've been talking about in terms of translating to the next generation of these things, is there anything that can be done or should be said at the level of resource allocation, at the level of top to bottom conversations about resources and grad training that deals with how to count and how to reward the caretaking side of these various projects? Because that ends up being, again, in my experience, a far greater labor than even getting something off the ground.
That's a great question. It's interesting because I'm just thinking about the structure of the way Nursing Clio works, right? And that we do have a tech editor who started out as a PhD student but now doesn't work in academia at all and in fact works in tech, right? And I'm just thinking about the ways in which so much of his work is in the background, right? So I don't have an answer to this yet, but it's interesting for me to think about in terms of how that work is not visible, but it's such a heavy burden to sort of keep up the work, make sure we're doing best practices, making sure we don't have dead links, making sure all of that is current, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only analogy may be then how a lab continues to function and the ways inside the vocabulary side of many institutions is then to think about the creation and the maintenance of a lab. And that this is in effect the humanities lab, and it requires these elements to function and work. Now, it's interesting because most universities will provide startup funds in the order of $2 to $3 million for a scientist to start his or her lab, and with the idea that they're then going to get external funding to support it in out years. And in fact, that's a measure of whether or not they should stay around the institutions, the degree to which they can get someone else to then begin to fund them and fund their lab. And the maintenance is then built into the funding mechanism. And that maintenance at two levels: the financial maintenance to do it, but then to hire a staff and whose job it is to keep it going. There is no model like that in the humanities per se, and in fact, in many institutions, colleagues who are the provost, not the deans, but actually the provost, say they end up being that funding mechanism for someone, particularly if the digital project gets to a certain scale, and they will come back at some point and say, all right, we need a sustainability model here. We need a sustainability model for the faculty, and we need one for the project. But I have never seen anything to scale. And I will even confess to this group, I remember lamenting at one point when I was provost, having to keep paying for something and trying to figure out, could we come up with better software that actually was learning software and where it wasn't jury-rigged in such a way that we got a whole volume of external people coming in, the thing will fall apart. And because there was that kind of maintenance too, is the reputational maintenance. When the piece fell apart and then you're all hands on deck for a day or two or three to try to get it back up for a while, and then you're scurrying for dollars again. And Mellon probably funded a little bit more of this than almost any other foundation I could think of in the United States, but even there was not enough. But here's the problem, right? So, give you an order of magnitude. We were sitting in a meeting at Mellon, and we're trying to figure out what it would take to digitize all the celluloid from the 20th century. Because we had all of these images and all of this film that was now disintegrated.
Right.
And so we're going to lose the whole 20th century. And the price tag was about $7 billion. And we realized, okay, we're going to cash out the Mellon Foundation.